Our keynote speaker today has a very interesting background. Aaron Woolf is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work is focused on such diverse topics as transportation, agriculture, immigration, and diplomacy. But a common theme throughout has been to relate stories that trace the human consequences of government policy. In 2000, Aaron directed Greener Grass, Cuba, Baseball, and the United States, a WNET-ITVS co-production that received the Banff Rocky Award. In 2003, he directed Dying to Leave, the global face of human trafficking and smuggling, which won an Australian Emmy Award for Best Documentary Series, aired as a 2-hour special on the PBS series Wide Angle, and has been screened at the State Department and the United Nations. In his 2010 film, Beyond Motor City, produced for PBS, focuses on America's transportation history and decaying infrastructure. Throughout May, June, and July of this year, Aaron has been touring the country speaking about America's transportation future, supported by a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. He is perhaps best known for his 2007 film, King Corn, an investigation of America's industrialized food system, which won a George Foster Peabody Award and led his work on a new tangent when he opened Urban Rustic, a Brooklyn, New York grocery specializing in locally sourced and organic foods. He divides his time between New York City and Elizabethtown, New York, and it's a pleasure to have Aaron with us today. You come forward.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Brian, so much for the introduction. It's really a great honor, and I think I'm a little bit nervous because I kind of feel like I'm presenting to family. I grew up, I spent a lot of my childhood in the Adirondacks, and there's that sense of kind of coming home today. This has been a place that is really, I'm just, I think, beginning to figure out the way that growing up around here has inspired my work. I turned 46 this year, and the number 46 in the Adirondacks has kind of a mystical meaning. I'm chagrined to admit that I'm not a 46er with my 46 years. You know, I always imagined that, that I would be by this time, and I even kind of calculated as a small child what year it would be when I turned 46. I'm very amazed, though, about the things I've seen change in the Adirondacks in my 46 years. Certainly, anecdotally, on my own property, species coming back that hadn't even been there in my parents' time. And I think that maybe that's why there's been this environmental thread to my work. I did spend a lot of time playing baseball at E-Town Lewis Summer Playground as a kid, and maybe that's why I did a film about baseball. But I wonder if my family's approach to food when I was growing up may have been the biggest influence of all here in the North Country. If so, it would have been against my wishes. We always kept a vegetable garden, assiduously composted organic food scraps, and complemented weekly trips to the small grocery on Water Street. I think before the Grand Union there was the A&P on Water Street in Elizabethtown. We would go to farm stands. There was not a farmer's market then. We'd go to farm stands on the road to Wadhams and always eat the sweet corn from the Saywards farm. 46 years ago there were 395 farms in Essex County. And I wouldn't be surprised if I was dragged to each and every one of them. My mother was very enterprising and very outgoing and an advocate of taking her children places that she really wanted to go. But I wanted nothing of it. Ever since that July day on the porch in Elizabethtown in 1969 when we all gathered on the radio to listen to the news of the first moon landing, I was convinced that I wanted to eat only what the astronauts ate. I accepted the popular notion that the beverage of choice for the astronauts was something called Tang. And in 1970, when Pillsbury Foods filed for a trademark for, I have to read this verbatim, a non-frozen balanced energy snack in rod form, containing nutritionally balanced amounts of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, which they imaginatively decided to call space food sticks. I was convinced that I was seeing the future of food, and I liked it. It's almost as if they had seen those same Star Trek episodes that I had seen. The Star Trek Enterprise, if you recall, flew around space on its 5-year mission to go boldly where no man had gone before. No woman either, I would add. And the way they ate on the Enterprise was they had this kind of goo in the hold. They didn't really specify where the goo was, although I was one of those dorks who would have bought the book that showed the blueprints of the ship. But I remember when they wanted to go eat, they would talk to the little computer and they would say, computer, I want, a steak and potatoes, and the ship would bring this goo up from the hold, and this goo could be impregnated with various chemicals of flavors and textures to approximate that food. How awesome. And as a kid I thought, man, how awesome and how futuristic. And how lonely I felt, thinking about how long it would be before I too would get to make and eat modern food made from goo, while suffering through all the local foods my family seemed to be so obsessed about. Luckily for me, however, there were plans afoot to transform our national food system into one that de-emphasized local production and increasingly prioritized the massive and distantly based production of a kind of 20th century goo. That goo is called corn. And when Earl Butts' recasting of the farm legislation was passed in 1973, the nation began pouring tens of billions of extra dollars annually into maximizing goo production across the country, and in effect, heavily subsidizing some of our least nutritious foods. It's a story that many of you know, and it's a story that I made a film about. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves that that same corn, which fattens cheap burgers, that adds the calories to the French fries and the corn oil, and of course the ubiquitous high fructose corn syrup, which sweetens not only our sodas, but thousands of other processed foods. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to call that stuff goo. It's inedible until it's processed. It's kind of an explosion of starch, which can be transformed to any number of processed foodstuffs. Corn-based starches and derivatives add bulk and texture to numerous snack foods. And corn byproducts are the most ubiquitous ingredients in processed foods. And if you've seen King Corn, I guess that's a little bit of a repetition. But when I set out to make King Corn, I really didn't know that there was any difference between the yellow dent #2 field corn that covers 90 million acres of the United States and that awesome stuff we got at the Saywards farm in Willsboro. But a couple of years growing, following, and filming industrialized corn taught me that it was an incredibly different product with incredibly different goals. That it was the prized product of a system that had evolved to prioritize productivity over any other consideration. The technology, of course, had gotten so good that a couple of rookies like me and my cousins could move to Iowa and in 1 year grow 10,000 pounds of food off a single acre of land, food that would be remarkably adaptable and remarkably cheap. There's no question that that is a remarkable achievement. And with the 20th century parameters in which it was conceived, seemingly inexhaustible fuel and water, little consciousness of the full cost accounting of the environmental impact of chemically intensive agriculture, and only cursory knowledge of the connection between big agriculture and climate change and climate disturbance, this agriculture made sense. I will hasten to add, maybe unpopularly today, that I think it still does make sense in a certain way. What we need to do is conceive of food systems that can complement, I think, rather than compete with big agriculture. But before we do, and before we figure out what the proportions are going to be, I think we have to really understand that the significant costs of our goo-based system are not always so easy to measure. In Washington, we often make policy based on things we can measure. In agriculture, we can measure inputs, we can measure yields. It's very hard to measure. It's very hard to measure exactly the public health costs of the food-related illnesses that our agriculture promotes.